Welcome to the Gus Alva Perspective, a videocast that is tied in with, thinking about abundance and gratitude over the counterpoint of fear and scarcity. Being a board certified psychiatrist and having been within the medical profession for over a quarter of a century, I've seen a lot of very important changes transpire in medicine. But there's one thing that certainly has always been true, and that is that when we take into consideration the functioning of different brain areas, it's really important to tie in specific areas and how their affectation or how their ability to work appropriately may lead to good or bad outcomes. The theme that I'd like to touch on today is that of your frontal lobe and the immaturity of the frontal lobe and what specific problems might ensue from a frontal lobe that has not fully developed yet. And not just to give specific areas of complaints or problems, I'll also address, maybe areas in which we might have potential strategies to counter the problematic areas that we identify in an immature frontal lobe. So I think it's important to first take into consideration what our frontal lobes do. Basically, if you take into context decision making or impulse control and or judgment, these are critical areas that are ruled by our frontal lobe. And bear in mind that during adolescence, the frontal lobe is still developing and maturing. And in fact, it will not fully develop in most people until they're in their early 20s. Now, what happens when the frontal lobe is not necessarily mature yet? Well, there's several points that I'd like you to take into consideration. In fact, I'm going to address four things. The first one is that risk-taking behavior is quite prominent. Think of reckless driving, substance abuse, or engaging in dangerous activities without considering the potential consequences that might ensue from engaging in a particular activity, meaning that brashness is certainly there. Poor decision making would be the second point that we oftentimes see. And young people are a great example in which they oftentimes will struggle with weighing the pros and cons of different circumstances and not necessarily think through alternative options before making a choice. A third point of problem is that of impulsivity and acting on immediate desires, such as spending money that one shouldn't, engaging in impulsive relationships, or making snap judgments without having a sufficient degree of information to actually make that decision can sometimes weigh heavily on someone. And the fourth area that I'd like you to think about is the emotional regulation and the challenges that an immature frontal lobe will bring with it. Meaning that with that immaturity, there's a difficulty in managing and regulating emotions effectively. We oftentimes see heightened emotional responses, mood swings, or struggling to control emotions in challenging situations. So, multiple examples that we just went over in which somebody that's younger, somebody that's not necessarily into their 20s yet, is oftentimes going to be experiencing. And through that, now we get an understanding as to why there are so many different problems that subsequently ensue and why there are certain guardrails that are set up societally. Why is it that people can't necessarily drink before a certain age? Why is it that people cannot go into the armed forces before a certain age? Why is it that people cannot own firearms before a certain age? Why is it that people should not be making certain decisions beyond or before a certain age? So now let's take a look at some potential strategies that we may employ individually or as a society to take into consideration these potential areas that are glaring examples of problematic areas in our youth. The first one is education and awareness. Videocasts like this can help us comprehend that although we might think that we pop out of the womb fully operant, that's not always the case. And there are different areas within our bodies and within our brains that require a degree of maturation. The second one is guidance and mentorship. And I can't speak sufficiently about this. It's so critical that we support our youth appropriately. A third area that would be important would be developing executive functioning skills. And what exactly would this be? Well, planning, problem solving, and self control. Ultimately, when we talk about executive functioning, these are the very areas that we are trying to foster additional control within our youth. And subsequently, emotional regulation training is another very important area that's relatively easy to do. Did you know that there are techniques like mindfulness or deep breathing exercises, or simply seeking support from mental health professionals that could help with assisting in developing healthier emotional regulation strategies? And the last point would be that of creating supportive environments. Through discouraging risky behaviors and promoting positive decision making, we can societally help our youth in fostering open communication. By setting clear boundaries, we basically state this is acceptable, this is not. And by providing opportunities for constructive engagement and personal growth, we'll ultimately see the appropriate maturation of young adults. So, as we've been addressing this particular theme, the frontal lobe continues to develop throughout adolescence and into early adulthood. We've all seen examples of this. In fact, on a very personal level, we basically see multiple examples where we oftentimes feel like, man, we could have done a bit more to be able to encourage that promotion of maturation in that frontal lobe for those that we care for. Time, proper guidance, and support help develop responsible and capable adults. And gratitude ultimately is about being part of the problem solving within our society rather than simply calling out the glaring deficits that exist. And being part of the solution will ultimately always garner a greater sense of satisfaction in us. I thank you for joining us on the Gus Alba Perspective for this topic that I think is so important, so salient, and particularly meaningful at this stage in time right now for our youth, and that is the fact that the frontal lobe, unfortunately, doesn't mature until we are in our early 20s. And that is something that oftentimes gets overlooked by many. Thank you very much for joining us.